Okay, well, it's 3 o'clock straight up, maybe a minute after, so we'll go ahead and get this session started. So again, the focus today is really going to be looking at the California public records laws that we've seen come into action over the course of the last year, and some of the new ones, the latest and greatest ones. We have some recent updates that we were just talking about even about an hour or so ago before getting into the session here, highly topical. And specifically how it relates to the risks that are inherent with these new communication types like social and mobile, especially text messaging and the use of social media networks within your organizations. Obviously the pressure for people to use them because of the goodness they provide, but they do come with a whole new set of requirements that you're going to have to implement so that you're in a position so you can respond to open records requests, which is just on the rise all over the place right now. So with that, I'll just jump in really quickly and introduce myself, and then I will pass the baton down to our panelists to introduce themselves. My name's Mike Pagani. I work for a company called Smarsh, and we are headquartered out of Portland. I have a little snippet on us in a minute, but I look after product marketing for the company. I'm also our chief evangelist, so I get to speak at conferences quite a bit. I get to write articles and kind of monitor what's going on in the industries that we provide solutions for. Prior to coming to Smarsh, almost 3 years now ago, I worked for Dell Software, and I ran product marketing for the mobility and BYOD practice there. Also subject matter expert on cyber in terms of identity and access management, as well as desktop and server virtualization. So kind of always on that sort of the new type of communicating and computing. So pulling from that as my background. But I'll pass it on down. So well, not in the same order as the slide, but Shawn, if you can introduce yourself, please.
My name is Shawn Savadkohi. I'm the Information Security Officer for the San Mateo County Health System. In the health system, we have a lot of interest in using impetus and using mobile technology as an enterprise within the enterprise. And so we are on the cusp of doing that, both from a technology standpoint and also looking through our policies and making those changes and having conversations around how does this work for us.
Good, thanks. Jackson? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jackson. Jackson Muhrwe, I believe you can hear me there. Work with the City and County of San Francisco as the Chief Information Security Officer. Prior to joining the city in this position, I worked in academia for about 3 years, where I was mostly doing teaching, research, and presenting in conferences on cybersecurity. Prior to that, I worked as a CIO for a diplomatic organization working internationally before I got into what I'm doing. So part of what we're doing today, what we're discussing today, is something that I deal with because I respond to public data requests, either through one of our offices in the city or through our legal teams. If we are doing an investigation and they need some data, they go through my office to get that.
Okay, thank you. Bonnie?
My name's Bonnie Page. I'm also at Smarsh. I'm the general counsel at Smarsh, which means I'm responsible for legal compliance and government affairs, which means I get to pay attention to all of the really interesting open records request laws, especially in the state of California this year.
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of activity. Yeah, lots to keep up with. So before we go much further, I just want to tell you we're going to break this into 3 sections, and what I like to do when I moderate is not save questions till the end, because then you're thinking about the question and it's not as topical at the end, kind of we've moved on. So what we'll do is we'll present and discuss each of these different topics, and then we'll stop for about 3 or 4 minutes and open the floor for questions, okay? So before we go to the next section. So the first part of this is we're going to look at what are really the social and mobile usage trends and the drivers that are necessitating us to respond now, to change the way we're doing things, to look at new systems, to look at new processes, new policies that need to be put into place. And associated with that, what are the risks, the challenges, and the pitfalls that you want to avoid? And we'll break down some of those as you're working towards putting a solution in place. And then the last part, we'll really be looking at best practices when it comes to things like policies and how do I implement those, training, things like that. And then having a technology component to automate this and to make it all, feasible for you so that you can really put a comprehensive solution in place to deal with this. Okay, so with that, I'll just jump in. Really quickly though, before we move on, I just want to tell you why, we became part of this and why we're here to kind of, help with the education side of this and coordinate the whole panel discussion. We've been in business since 2001, so we've been in this game of archiving electronic communications and doing it for compliance purposes for a long time. We started in the financial services industry. I'd say about 60-some-odd% of all FINRA, wealth managed brokerage firms use us to respond to things for regulatory requirements and examination, producing records and things like that, and supervising communications in highly regulated industries. We've got about 300 plus customers now on the federal, state, and local entity side of things. And in fact, we've actually got pulled into the public sector space a few years ago, as opposed to pushing into it, just because this open records thing became such a big deal. So it's that need to retain and be able to respond quickly and in a timely manner, okay? And knowing that it's not just about email anymore. A lot of people say, why are you called Smarsh? It's an interesting name, sounds fun to say. But our founding CEO, and still the CEO today, is a fellow by the name of Steve Marsh. Came out of the financial services industry in New York, and that was his email address. So back in the day, it was all about email, right? But now there's so many more different channels we communicate over, but that's, people always ask the question. We're a leader in the Gartner Enterprise Information Archiving Magic Quadrant, as well as the Forrester Wave for archiving technologies. And what we really deliver is one place to capture all this stuff, and that spans your email, text messages these days, instant messaging. There's about 14 different instant message platforms, Skype for Business or whatever you're using in your workplace. All of your web content, social media, just a myriad of social media channels that we capture the content for directly from them. So we get, Twitter messages from Twitter, LinkedIn posts from LinkedIn, and that's a big deal to get it directly from the source without third-party conversions. And we keep everything in its proper context. A lot of older archiving systems will take those messages and turn them into an email format, but you lose a lot of the context. And in fact, you got to be careful there, because as you're putting it away, if you're converting it into a format that's altering the record too materially, it could break the chain of custody. And then it's actually not even admissible if it's been altered in too much. It wants to be kept in its native format to keep everything where it needs to be to satisfy the requirements of the law. Again, we automate capture from everywhere, and what we do is we basically take unstructured data, this communications, and we make indexes and keys out of them. So you can do keyword searches, lexicons, words that are close to other words. So when you're retrieving, you can put in one set of search criteria that spans all your communications out of the one place. So that's really where we, stick our flag on the top of the mountain there. So we have a discovery module for legal people. So if you're doing a legal preparation for a case, you can use this to pull all the content out and package it up. Creates built-in audit trails of, when you look at the records, you can attach notes to them and keep a history of it and what you decided to do. You can put legal holds on things so that you don't delete records that are coming up, to meet a certain retention period. You don't want to get rid of them if there's an ongoing, case or legal action. And then we just provide a myriad of different sort of packaging options to hand them off for further legal discovery or to the courts. Okay? So that's just a little snippet on what we do. So let's look at some of these trends. Just like to put this graphic up to get the conversation started here. I mentioned we started, with email, but nowadays the conversation has shifted, and it's for a number of reasons, right? Consumerization of IT, shadow IT, or sometimes it's called. The role that millennials and Gen Xers are playing in not only the communities that we serve, but also in our own workforce, that are getting exposed to and using all of these wonderful communication tools, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, all of the things that they're communicating with on a daily basis. Very highly effective, right? Extremely productive and quick, but they do cause certain issues. So what I like to say is that the business communications conversation has shifted to these new tools, and this is what we have to adapt to. And again, if there's anything that it's not just enough to produce emails, all the conversations being used for business here, including text messaging. So with that, maybe I could work down the panel a little bit. So Shawn, just some thoughts on inside your organization, the role that mobile and social media communications is playing with the community that you serve and between your employees, if you could maybe just shed some light.
Okay. We recognized 3 years ago that we had an issue. We had county employees within the health system who were issued county mobile devices, and they were instructed by policy to use them primarily for voice calls and other types of communication that they were capable of on their phones that they were to avoid. That can be a little bit challenging when you're trying to conduct your line of business and do your work, and the rest of the populace that you're trying to serve may be wanting to do it in a different way. And so there was an example recently where we had a behavioral health specialist who was trying to reach a high-risk client for an appointment, hadn't been able to contact them recently, left voicemails, and never got a response. Decided, heck with it, I'm going to try sending them a text. Got a response in a few minutes. And so we realized that while we had policies that were somewhat prohibitive about the use of mobile technology, that avoiding it and avoiding all of the features and the functionality and the technology that can come with it was limiting our ability to do a service to our customers. So we've had now since to be able to look at different strategies, changing our policies to not only making that admissible, but doing it in a way that allows us to maintain our compliance, with HIPAA and CMIA and those kinds of things, and now with this new ruling from the California Supreme Court.
So using it for the goodness that the communication method can provide, the immediacy, the far reach, the amplification of it, and the awareness, but also mitigating the risks.
Right.
Yeah, it's a balancing act. So Jackson, maybe some of your experience.
So our experience, I think, is similar to County of San Mateo. We've had employees initially using their own devices, and then at some point the city started issuing them mobile devices, depending on employees' role within the city functions. If your supervisor deems it necessary for you to have a mobile device, you have one. Now, you may conduct some of your business using either your personal device or the city-owned devices. Now, we found there was a lot of risk in terms of data that's being transacted on those devices. We had no control. What kind of, who has access to those devices? Where does that device go? What if that device is lost? What happens? So we decided to look for various ways of addressing some of the risks related to data that's on those devices, the emails, text messages. And now we've added also other applications, not only emails, but we are also doing service requests that are being transacted and everything completed via the mobile device. So a lot of data is being conducted over the mobile device more than sometimes on the computer. So how do we address that? So we found ways to go about that. First of all, looking at what can we manage, what is within, so we identified the various risks and prioritized them, and we decided we are going to first of all focus on our city-owned devices because we have control over those.
So you have both models, right? You have,
we have both models.
City-issued devices, and you also have people bringing their own to work, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's the duality, yeah.
Yeah. So because you want to make sure that you enable users to be able to conduct their business. If, for example, I issue a policy today and say, you cannot use your personal device to conduct city business, so many people may not be able to complete some of their work. And then again, if we issue such a policy, then we have unions on the side that say, hey, you have this policy. Are you going to have an expectation on these people to complete their job without you allowing them to use their personal devices, and you have not issued them with a city device? So it's kind of something that we have to balance. So we've come up with some solutions, address the city-owned device, and also provided for a way for them to be able to bring their own devices and use them to be able to conduct city business within certain limitations.
Yeah, that's good. And actually, the third section of this talk, we're going to just unpack the two models and the pros and cons of both, just what you need to look at there. Just a quick show of hands. How many people are allowing a bring your own device, people to use their own personal devices in the workplace, just in your organization? Okay. How many have gone the government issued, or the the employer issued model? How many are doing both? Everybody, right? Pretty much. Yeah. Or no, you're just employer. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we see it, where it's either completely employer issued and people are carrying two phones, or, but the pressure's there to, to leverage the personal device. It's a savings for you as an organization, and it's also a convenience for the employee. But you got to manage it, is the thing. So, okay. Well, thank you. And so let's look at this now. Just kind of looking at mobile and social, just really quickly. This is a fresh statistic I pulled at the end of last year. From a company called Sample. 6.1 billion texts are sent every day, and that's just in the USA. Worldwide, I believe, yes, it's 23 billion every day. Okay, it's staggering, isn't it? It's just absolutely staggering. The other stat that's not on here is 97% of people who have the ability to text, sort of taking away, younger people and things like that are the equation, but 97% will send and receive at least one text message every day worldwide. 97% of all individuals who are. It's ubiquitous. Another stat that I thought that was interesting is with the mobile apps, a change year over year. So in 2016, messaging and social jumped up by 44%, growing faster than sports, business, finance, shopping. So we're not using these devices so much for surfing anymore or buying things. We're actually using it for communicating in one form or another, either through the text messaging interface on the phone or through some of the instant message channels that exist in the social apps, right? Or posting or doing things like that. So we're using it for messaging and social is the primary, by a wide margin. That's by far number one here. So, which brings us to the other intersection of the two. So we know that text messaging is kind of a runaway thing that just everybody does it because it's in our hands all day long. Social is where a lot of the conversations are going. And when I speak at local government events, we have positions called, social outreach coordinators. We're using social media for the power that it has, right, to spread the word, especially, we're seeing now with all the disasters that have been happening, right, how important a role social media and text messaging has played, right? So the thing that I'm intrigued by here is the stats that I've seen from Gartner is the mobile device in our hands is, I think it was 88% of all social media activity is conducted over a mobile phone versus a laptop or a desktop, which I thought was very, very interesting. But it's a double-edged sword because it gives us the ability to post and respond on the spot, in the moment, where we are, right? Whenever news is breaking or whenever there's something in the business that requires us to respond. But it can sometimes enable us to circumvent policy and procedure. You could be prone to a quick response that maybe didn't follow the proper approval path. Which brings me to the third point, and I'm going to direct this one to Bonnie to get her comments on this, is we see this use case a lot where you might be capturing the social side of things, or maybe you've got a solution just for social. You've spent a week or two to put together a really nice social media outreach campaign that you're going to post. Something happens that day in the community that necessitates talking to a higher level official to say, can we still go ahead and do this? Or do you want to change this? Can I get approval from you to do this? Okay? And how do we get a hold of that person when it's in the 11th hour? We're going to text them. Around our place at work, we say, if we want a response in 3 hours, send an email. If you want it in 3 minutes, send a Skype for Business IM. If you want it in 3 seconds, text them. So we tend to fall back to this texting, right? But what if you're not archiving that? What if you're not recording that? So Bonnie, what does that cause as far as like how, what kind of a challenge is that from a legal sense or satisfying the law, right?
Right. So I think the California Supreme Court case was pretty clear that if the communication involves government business, it has to be retained and it has to be produced. I think my co-panelists kind of demonstrate the desire to enable business through technology. So marrying the legal and the business desire, you really have to figure out how you're going to capture and produce these kinds of communications.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a great answer. So basically, if your compliance perimeter or what you're capturing for the purpose of responding to the records request doesn't encompass text messaging, that's going to be a bit of a problem, because on one hand, it is just kind of internal, but if somebody gets a screen capture of a response or something, think about that worker. They might have said, well, you know what, this is a decision higher up than me. If somebody questions this, I'm going to take a screen capture of that and keep that, so at least I can say, no, I didn't make the decision, this person did. That will surface when the heat comes on, right? So it will surface and it does come up. Which brings us to kind of the center point of why we're here. Let's look at these new laws impacting California local government entities. So Bonnie, let's stick with you and we'll come back down the panel. What I've got up on the screen here is the California Supreme Court ruling that hit and everybody talked about in March, basically discussing text messages on private devices, whether it's government issued or it's your own, whatever the implications are there, and the business relevance really dictating the jurisdiction over that. And then also most recently, California Assembly Bill 1479, if you could comment on that too. I have on the slide here last amended September 1st, but there was an update on the 19th 2 days ago, and I'll let Bonnie discuss that one. But basically, I'll let you maybe elaborate on both of these. Yeah.
Sure. I can imagine that the California Supreme Court ruling was kind of scary to everybody in this room. How are you going to possibly control records that are outside of your perimeter? I think it's a tough question. It's hard to control activities by people who don't want to be controlled. You can put a policy in place. You can try to use technology. One of the things that I thought was interesting about the case is that they did give some, guidance on how you could probably manage the use of communication channels outside of your perimeter of control. You could allow your employees to do their own search on their own personal devices, and they kind of gave a laundry list of what that might look like, what they have to look like. They'd have to look at the content, the context, the purpose of the message, who it was sent to, and whether that person was acting within their employment capacity. I think every business has to kind of make the determination of whether they want their employees to actually conduct those searches, and if those searches would lead to producing all the records you're required to produce, but that's certainly one option that the court gave. Mm-hmm. They also kind of looked at what the federal what happens at the federal level in Freedom of Information Act cases and the use of affidavits and whether or not those would be appropriate in the state of California. And I think they kind of gave an indication that you could use the federal process and that would be defensible. But again, that would be kind of relying on employees to make that determination. And I think you have to make the determination in your own business if that's something that you want to do or not.
Yeah, and they'd have to be trained thoroughly on the policies, right? Bonnie,
correct. That was one of the caveats to using the federal process. They said that if employees are well trained, then they can perform the searches on them by themselves. So I think you'd have to look at your training program and make sure your training program was defensible before you would allow something like that to happen.
And then specifically with 1479, it's just designating a specific custodian resource, right? Either an individual or an office. Mm-hmm. To be responsible for producing all that? Right, and that was enrolled and presented on the 19th, so that's coming, that's here. Yes, question?
So where in any of that does it say that we have to create an archiving solution for text messaging?
Well, it doesn't necessarily say that you have to create an archiving solution, but if you're communicating about government business, you have to be able to produce that upon request. So that is the California Open Records Act.
Yeah, and where it gets dicey is the timely response, because 1479, I think it's 10 days is the initial period that they give you to respond to it. It can be pushed to 14 with a written, explanation of why you need more time.
Yeah,
but
I believe that ruling says if the information is available. So I've been trying to find a solution that says I have to create that information. Because if I don't have the information available, because I haven't implemented an archiving solution for text messaging, then...
So I think the one thing that the court, subtly did is say that they're not going to allow people to circumvent the California Open Records Act by saying it's outside of our control. So I'd probably be pretty careful with those analyses. If there's a record relating to public business, you probably want to make sure that you're keeping it.
If it
the problem is I don't have a tool. I haven't applied the budget to create a tool to archive that.
Right.
And real quick, We're
This is
obviously dealing with a lot of the same things with the city of Blair.
good.
But if, for instance, your email, you can set a retention period on your email, but no law requiring you to say 2 years. I mean, a lot of them have 2 years. I've seen some states have like 30 days, which, would be real upsetting for our people, but you can delete email. So I think on that same note, as long as it's not an official record, something like police and all the other things that, agenda and stuff like that, I would assume, is there anything that requires a retention period on that? I mean, that's the legal question. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Well, so every every jurisdiction is different. Every state, county is different in terms of what their record retention laws are. So I wouldn't be able to answer that kind of globally for the room, but I think you should know what your record retention requirements are exactly. And if you're deleting within your record retention, you're following that policy, then there shouldn't be a problem. And if you've deleted it according to that policy, then you wouldn't be expected to produce it.
Isn't it generally 5 to 7 years in that range typically that we see, or? No.
Official record, what kind of record it is.
Right.
So if you email or text a medical record or something you have, that's 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Yeah, but the email wouldn't be the official law.
Well,
I don't know
but
if it
that correspondence, you have to put that date it says, and then you document it in the record structure.
is. Exactly. So I was just thinking,
Maybe
it's
set
tough.
up for
It's tough.
financial records, and then if you're doing E-rate for education for federal funding, because now becomes 7 or almost 10 years with the correspondence.
And that would probably be somewhere outside email or text.
That is part of the email. If you're my consultant and I'm applying for federal money,
Yeah.
I'm emailing you correspondence to circuits and more pretty equivalent.
If you're discussing that business of the government, yeah, then it becomes jurisdiction. Yeah, and that's the tricky part, right? Because I think we're going to get to this in the next section, because I can already see the conjecture in here, what is or is not a public record, and how long do I have to keep them, and things like that. But maybe Jackson and Shawn, can you
Yeah.
comment on the sort of the letter of the law, the spirit of the law,
Yeah, probably the challenge here, so for those of us who may be on the side of the organization where we have to enable the collection of this data, that's what becomes, for example, according to the Supreme Court ruling, this extends to personal devices,
Yes.
which are outside of our control. How do you deal with that? So, for example, I've mentioned already, we know we have a mechanism to manage the city-owned devices. And if we want to be able to collect data on those, it's very easy to do that. But how about these ones here? Now, technology, or in terms of the solutions that we advocate for, the solutions that we implement, should be in such a way as to be able to support the legal requirements or any other requirement that could be either compliance requirements, but in this case here, we have legal requirements to be able to provide solutions that can be able to address such kind of demands.
Yeah.
And I've seen, in our case, the city of San Francisco, we have some solutions that we are coming up with citywide to be able to address some of these, but we still have the challenge of the personally owned devices, how
Right.
to address them.
Yeah, and I will show that, like, the two different models on how to make sure you are grabbing these things and automating it. at the end of this,
And a
but
quick
Shawn.
comment to this gentleman's
Yeah.
concern about, hey, I don't have
Yeah.
the information in my possession. That was the city of San Jose's defense for the Supreme Court ruling. So if you read the body of the ruling, it was an overturn of a lower court ruling. City of San Jose was sued by an activist who said they wanted a Freedom of Information request to receive it. Came to learn that someone, a City of San Jose employee, sent on their personal device a message conducting government business to a developer, and that wasn't included. The Supreme Court said, yes, that should have been included in the Freedom of Information Act, and the city's defense wasn't upheld because the Supreme Court said it doesn't matter where the business is being conducted. That's not our concern.
Right.
The fact that it was being conducted, it should have been part of the request. So I think all of us are really concerned who are in government and have a responsibility for being able to answer to public record requests.
Yes.
How do we get a hold of that information? How do we audit it, whether it's on a government-issued device or on a BYOD device?
See, it's interesting you bring this up, because I've always maintained, just as a technologist, that this stuff leaves a footprint, right? And I know exactly, but don't get lulled into a false sense of security, because the mobile carriers only keep text messages for about 5 to 7 days, okay? And then it falls off their systems. So if it's deleted, but the problem is if somebody's made a screen capture of it, or it's somehow going to live, which it does, and it surfaces, then that's going to get you on the back end. So that's the rub.
Still resides on this.
It can.
Because
Well,
until it gets overwritten, it's a SQL-like database.
absolutely. But what if somebody deletes all that out of there and it's not on the servers
But
anymore?
it's still in there, so you can take the software
Yeah.
to parse out the back file.
You could. Yeah.
And then you pull it back up. There's
Right.
software out there that does it.
Right.
I have
But
a hard time thinking that, well,
yeah, and this is where it gets difficult, though. And you're up against the clock, right? So as opposed to having a system that's just saying, okay, look, we have it, and we can make it easy to produce. That's kind of where we're headed. But so if we want to summarize all this up, like what we're dealing with here, look, there's no argument about the sheer volume of the communications, right? It's up across the board. But it's not just the volume that's driving us to these ends. It's the diversity of the communication types and the channels. It's this impact of the millennials and the Gen Xers in your community and within your workforce. It's the use of personal devices, accounts, and channels, right? It gets very interesting. In fact, we've seen a number of cities, and we partner up with a company called Hootsuite that does social media consolidation, so you can stage up content to push out. And they have a product called Amplify. It goes on your mobile phone, and as an employee of the government, if they want to get the word out about something, you can actually use personal social media accounts for approved content to push it out. Well, if you're not capturing that on the back end, then, out of Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever, then there could be additional things that happen with that. So it's just, there's great possibility here, but if it's not within your compliance perimeter, you're actually, creating more problems for yourself because it all leaves a footprint. And there's just a lack of formal usage policies, gaps in retention, and just this inability to respond to records requests in a timely manner. I think back to that, in the spirit of the Supreme Court, I think it was the ACLU, right, that challenged the LAPD because they kept coming back with the response, we lack the resources to produce the records in the time limits that were put upon them. And the court said, well, that's just too bad because it's your burden to produce these things. And it didn't, it's just, that's not a proper response. And again, the activists, right, they use this as a platform to further their cause, right, because it creates such attention. So they're not going to go away. And if stuff is discernible, it's going to surface. And the problem we have is there's still way too many manual processes and related activities that just take way too long to get all this collated. We're pulling it from different sources and we're trying to, rationalize it. It's not thorough, right? And it's certainly not efficient. So, and we have these new laws now that we have to adhere to for California local government entities. So what are some of the pitfalls here? So I think we've kind of unearthed one of them in the discussion here is just, what do I really need to keep? And what constitutes a public record? What can I be challenged for that I don't have and get into trouble with because I didn't save it proactively? And this is a quote from Charles Davis, the executive director of the National Freedom of Information Coalition. And he basically says, I don't care if it's delivered, it's not how it's delivered. You could deliver it by a carrier pigeon. It's a record. If you're using public time or your public office, you're creating public records. And I added this little thing at the bottom. I said, but wait, there's more, right? It's like the Ginsu knife or the chop chop. There's a little more here because that's true, but that doesn't address the issue of, well, what if I'm using my own personal device or I'm using my own texting plan? Is that still part of it? So what is or isn't a public record? I know we've talked a little bit about it, but Bonnie, could you maybe just crystallize this for everybody? Because I think many government entities believe that privacy law can protect them from this, for things done outside of government systems or personal channels and devices.
Well, there are 76 exceptions to what is and what isn't a government,
only 76?
or what has to be produced.
Okay.
So I can understand why privacy law would sometimes get thrown in there because many of those exceptions deal with privacy law, but the California Supreme Court was clear that it's anything that has to do with public business. So it isn't necessarily just public time or public office. You could be outside of your office after hours and conducting public business, and that's a record that has to be retained.
Okay, so it's basically, this answers the next question here, like emails, text messages, social media, all of that needs to be produced, even if it's outside of the government's controlled systems or the government supplied systems, if it is relevant to the business of the government or something that could be the subject of a legal matter or a challenge or a public records request, it's in the bounds. Is that what you're saying?
Right,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
We also have the other areas that, this is probably lesser known, and maybe grouped in the government.
Mhm.
This is the K-12 education center.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So you have social media, a teacher.
Yep.
Puts up a page, whatever, and the students are conversing and they're seeing stuff, and the teacher says, hey, contact me online, text me.
Yep.
Okay, that's outside, right? So that happens a lot. We get a lot of those calls, and I said, we can't have that. We Because social media, you can get that information, but if a child says, if a teacher says that a child just text me later tonight, I'll help you with your homework, and it leads to something else, that's a whole different ball.
Right, which is again, when I show you the next section, like the need to separate these two, right? So now, if I was the K through 12 entity, I would want my teachers to have an application to say, look, don't respond from your personal side of your phone. You want to use it from the business application side, which can be archived and it's policy, you know, those technologies have evolved a lot, okay? So,
And I'd just add, I'd go back to the California Supreme Court case where they said content, context,
Yeah.
purpose,
There you go, yeah.
scope of duties, and kind of analyze it that way.
yeah. Which brings us to the next part of this, another challenge here, and I'm going to ask Shawn and Jackson to comment on this. I get asked this question all the time. Employees, workers, the community, whatever, they start surfacing these new ways to communicate, like Snapchat and WhatsApp. And there's a new one that terrifies me. It's called Confide. You can look it up. It literally is ephemeral in the sense that you can send a message to another individual, and once they read it, it disappears. So that's a problem when it comes to, and none of these, I mean, we support about 80 plus different, you know, content provider channels that we capture directly. None of these want to work with us because it's not part of their business model. So maybe I'll start with Shawn. Shawn, have you had employees come to you, or do people want to use these kind of things and you have to say, look, you can't use this stuff in a workplace?
Short answer is sort of.
Okay, yeah.
You know, we do have a lot of momentum for people wanting to use mobile devices. I don't know how many people here are part of agencies who participate in a whole person care. San Mateo County is one of the counties in California that's participating in a whole person care pilot, which means we have public health nurses who are working with community-based organizations to be able to, basically it's for homeless people to
Nice.
limit the number of ED visits that a homeless person makes. So they're looking at the whole person. They need food, they need clothing, they need
Trying to be
housing.
proactive to
They're
cut
trying
down
be
on
posing.
the-
And so
yeah.
there's a clinical side to that. They all want to use mobile technology to be able to collaborate. And so there's lots of different agencies in that. And so they're saying, hey, can we use our mobile technologies? And this is where, you know, we're having to make changes in policy. We're having to
Yeah.
be, instead of, again, I use the word prohibitive, we're having to be admissible. How can we make this happen, but in
Yeah.
a way that allows us to meet our regulatory requirements, to have security controls in place, to do auditing, and to make sure that sensitive information is protected. So yeah, we are having those questions come up, but we're trying to embrace an enterprise-wide solution.
So give
as
them
opposed
a
to
prescriptive
give them
solution,
something
yeah.
to use that will allow them to do that
Yeah,
kind of work.
and that is, I think, at the heart of it. Jackson, maybe, have you had people ask you for some of these applications?
They may not ask me directly,
Okay.
but I think as we get different generations
Yep.
in the same workplace, you find their tastes and preferences are different. So for example, the millennials may want to use more out-of-band kind of communication media, which is outside our control.
Right.
So how do you address such? So for example, some of our colleagues would prefer to use Slack
Yep.
instead of using another solution we have in-house
Yep.
that could be able to help them do exactly the same thing
For their collaborative work, right?
for their collaborative
Yeah.
work. So I think where we come in is to understand what are their needs.
Yeah.
How can we help them be able to collaborate while still addressing our legal, our compliance requirements.
Yeah.
And also the other part of that is a lot of education, us being able to educate our various constituents, our users, share with them what's possible, what's available,
There you go.
and how you can be able to use what you already have,
So what is allowed?
what is
Yeah,
allowed.
yeah.
So for example, Microsoft is creating a new solution that's kind of helping meet some of these out-of-band communications that some employees will prefer to use to collaborate. And as a government, so we see that and say, oh, okay, we can acquire this solution. It will be able to address this need here.
Perfect. Yeah. So have a tool that they can use in a prescriptive way that still gets the needs of the business solved, right?
Yeah.
So they know they have an approved way of doing it, which really kinds of, and you know, we were talking about archiving things, but as these channels surface, like you mentioned Slack, for example, okay? So we've been working with Slack for a couple of years now, and it's been interesting to watch, their mission is to basically usurp email, right, as the way that we communicate and things like that, as the mainstream communication. And it's gaining tremendous traction. And we use it all the time in our product teams. We're in Slack more than anything else these days. And it's just yet another application. So this brings us to this chart here. So when we look at technology and specifically archiving this stuff in an automated way to make sure you're grabbing it all, email, not an issue. But if you're talking about what we're doing with these mobile devices, both the social and messaging side of it, we put out a survey about a month or two ago, and a good number of them are local government entities. Like, it was a government-focused public sector survey. When we asked people, how confident are you that you're capturing these things and you can produce them? Well, only like about 6 or 7% said they were completely confident that they had all the records, okay? So that was very telling to us. And if you look at the top end, there's about, almost 60% that have no confidence or minimal confidence. So how do we solve for this? I know we're coming up about another 5-10 minutes here, so I want to move around to some solutions. We've talked about a lot of challenges right now, so one of the things is just your policies, right? If you're going to put a policy in place, by the way, how many people in the room have written, formal, communicated policies around usage and retention for mobile and social communications in the room? Some, right? So this is the thing. We conducted a lot of webinars and things, and people always say at the end, is there a starting point that I can have for it? So I'll bring you to a resource that we're going to make available to you here too. But the one thing you want to do in your policies is be clear and explicit. So one of the things that we recommend is, you just brought it up, Jackson, to say, here are the channels that are allowed. Okay, don't list what's not allowed, because that list changes almost daily. There's new ones that pop in. So someone can't say, well, I was using Snapchat because it didn't show up on the things that we're not allowed to use. They say, well, is it part of the allowed ones? No. Well then, ergo, it's not. So make it really clear in your communications. Training is critical. At regular intervals, like when you get new hires in, make sure that's part of the new hire onboarding so they understand. Don't wait till the next cycle or whatever. And make sure if there's any significant updates that you communicate it to your employees. And I would say use a system that leaves an audit trail proving that your employees were made aware of this. Okay, so electronic attestation. Put the policy up in an electronic system. There's a bazillion of them out there as SaaS services. And make sure that the employees certify that they've read it and they understand it and they will willfully comply with it. It's a very important point. It's one thing to have a policy, it's another thing not to communicate it and make sure they're aware. So one of the things that we're providing here, and there's a link to this that we'll make available to you, is we created our own sort of set of retention of records policy template here for both government-owned devices and personally owned devices and personal accounts, just as a starting point for you. And Bonnie, maybe you can address this one. Why we did this.
Yeah, so we had a lot of customers, especially after the California Supreme Court ruling, ask us how they would address this. And so we put together a policy that addressed personal use of either personal devices or other accounts that you might be using, and how you would address those in addition to using government devices as well. And we worked with outside counsel to kind of put this together. It's obviously not legal advice, but it's a good thought starter, and it's a good way to start the conversations in your organization about how you would manage them by policy, in addition to any technological controls.
Just really quick, so Shawn and Jackson, do you have policies in place, written policies, Shawn, around how?
Yes, and our policy addresses both personally owned devices and county devices.
Okay.
Although I've picked out a couple of things in there that we should probably add to our policy.
Right.
Yeah, we do also have various policies regarding data. We have deferred data retention policies to specific departments. So we do not have like a citywide.
Okay, so it's on a departmental basis.
Yeah, it's on a departmental basis because departments have ownership of the data.
Okay, and that's interesting, right? Because the departments have different business needs and roles, right, relative to what the data is going to be that they're producing, right?
Yeah, but also in addition to that, so recently we drafted a data classification kind of standard to help departments classify their data, know which one would be public, which would be maybe sensitive.
Oh, so they're aware of which ones are, when they're crossing over the line.
Right.
Okay. So the last minute or two here, I just want to touch on the role that technology can play in all of this. So if you do put in a comprehensive archiving solution that can catch all of this stuff from its source and put it all into one place, which is what we advocate, you can effectively govern your policies this way. It's one thing to have the written policies, it's one thing for employees to understand it, but how do I implement this in a way that I can respond? Okay, how am I making sure that I'm capturing everything that I need to capture if I do get asked to produce it? So the automation of this is critical, because if there's too many manual processes to do this, you've got time lapses, you're gonna have gaps in retention, and that they're kept in their proper formats, that you're not converting things. So the end result is we want to create a quick, efficient process for records requests. This is just, now we're one solution out there, but one of the things I like to tell people is just make sure that whatever solution you implement has the ability to capture and search in a very granular way across the board, right, for all the different things you're doing, that you're able to set retention periods, apply legal holds, do all of that management for the process, right? And then that it spans, all of the different content types that you're using. We just acquired a company in the UK called Cognia, so we're actually able to archive voice now too, on top of everything else. And then, we're working towards indexing that down the line, because those requirements have been there in the European theater, but they're starting to surface now over here in the States. That's a big area of debate. So very quickly, just a quick little schematic here. How do we do this, right? So we've got the personal devices that you want to use for work. We've talked about containerization. This is just a picture of how it really manifests itself. You have an employee who brings their personal device to work. You put an application on there that creates a second phone number. So there's actually two phone numbers associated with that one physical device. And it creates a separate texting environment, as far as contacts and things like that. So basically, if it's a personal nature discussion, use the built-in iMessage, that's fine. Otherwise, use the government-supplied app that's on here to communicate, because the problem is iMessage is encrypted. And Apple wouldn't even encrypt it for the FBI. So you're not going to be able to archive that. Okay, that's going to stay personal. So don't do any government business through this personal communication method. So it basically turns the phone into two personas. You have your business and your personal and your business, but you can automate the capture of that into the archive. On the other side, you've got your government issued devices. And the reason I say SMS texting plan is the same issue exists there. You want to make sure you have, either through a mobile device management platform like an AirWatch or something like that, or if you have a lot of Apple devices, Apple makes this lovely product called DEP, which is the Device Enrollment Program. So you can manage settings and apps and things like which apps can be on there and which settings centrally, and the employees cannot override it, okay? So, for example, I would want to turn off iMessage so that you're using the green messages, not the blue ones, okay? So get a corporate texting plan, make sure they're using that device, turn off iMessage so it's not present there, restrict the apps they can do, and you've got yourself a solution. And we have relationships directly with AT&T, Verizon, US Cellular, et cetera. We're getting it from their servers. So even if they delete it off the phone, we've already got it. It's in near real time, yeah.
So you have an arrangement with Verizon to get a BYOD device information?
Absolutely too, yes. So we have an application actually that we install on the device. This is different. So if it's not necessarily through the carrier. So we're just installing an application on the device no matter which network they're using. And this also, we are also provisioning the phone number through, yes, when it comes to the business line, it would be propagated by the carrier. It's actually a voice over IP. It's a data-driven voice application, but it runs over cellular, yeah, on whichever network you happen to be using. Yeah.
I would assume there probably would be some legal issues if someone's using their personal device and there's nothing in the baseline that says that I give the city rights to my personal device. I don't think you're going to be able to put an application on.
Well, it depends, because all we're saying is that the only information that we're able to get is contained in that application. So we restrict that. The limitation is only within that application. Anything else is out of bounds for us. But and they have to attest the policy that they should be using the business supplied application for business communications. That's the key. Yeah. Okay, so you can do it either way. But my point is, if you have both, look for a solution that can automate this and put it all into the same place. So at the end of the day, to summarize everything we've talked about here, is everything used for government business is potentially a record, okay, if it surfaces, if it becomes the subject of a request. What you can do proactively to capture all this and to automate all this, the technologies exist today, so explore them to make your life a little easier. It's not time sensitive on the way in when you're grabbing all this stuff, but it is when you have to pull it out. Okay, so if you create the indexes and make it easy to retrieve, you're well ahead of the game. Prohibition does not work. Okay, telling people not to do it, they will do it. Okay, survey after survey is confirming this these days. If you solve for the risk, you can fully enable all the good that these communication channels can provide, and there's a good reason. People are trying to get their jobs done. There's very few that have a nefarious, intent. It's just they're trying to do their job. Training, training, training. It's a critical success factor for both your people who are administering this and the employees themselves, how to communicate. And automate as much as possible, but don't create silos in the process. If you automate pieces of this, it can make your life much more difficult because you have to collate the results, and they're in different formats, and it's a lot of work. Final thoughts from the panel. Shawn.
I think that it's important to be able, from the policy standpoint, to be able to have that conversation and bring in all the stakeholders within your organization. Mobile's not going to go away, and your staff, your employee workforce is going to need to use it. So being able to allow them to use it in a way that meets standards, regulatory requirements, I think is an important discussion that needs to happen. And in the next few years, we're going to be seeing more mobile devices being used within the government space.
And we're starting to see a lot more collaboration, like the legal departments working with the mobile team and IT, talking to marketing or the outreach coordinators and things like this. People are starting to work together. Jackson, last thoughts.
Well, key things to understand the requirements, legal requirements, understand what your organization needs and the kind of employees you have, the kind of staff that you have, and then provide a conducive environment for them to be able to do their work and also be able to meet your legal requirements.
Yeah. Bonnie?
You guys took what I was going to say, so I would say use the guidance that the California Supreme Court gave you to kind of manage the entire universe, and I think there's some good nuggets of information in there for the things that really are outside of your control.
There's some good examples in there to follow. Okay, well, with that, I realize we've got about 10 minutes to get you to the next session, but I just want to thank everybody. Awesome engagement, by the way. Love the questions along the way. Hopefully, we've been able to clear up, just some of the conjecture around all this and provide some actionable things. And here are just some, these are quick little links that we shorten them up here just to some of the resources. We've got that policy template, that sample one. Is accessible through this. And again, these decks are going to be made available to you, so you'll have the links. We've got a public safety guide to text messaging. We've got a public sector text messaging guide to policy and retention. And we've also got a public sector social media strategy and policy guide. So with that, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of it.